The world froze as war raged mercilessly. There, at the edge of the planet, where the wind howls like a wounded animal and darkness lasts for days, stretches the Arctic, a vast, white, silent, and deadly expanse. It wasn't just cold. It was an enemy. A kind of enemy that didn't need weapons. A gust of wind was enough to take a man's breath away, or a thin layer of ice to swallow an entire ship without leaving a trace. It was there, in that remote place, that the Soviet Union's hope hung by an almost impossible thread. Germany advanced like a furious hammer, destroying cities, crushing armies, pushing millions of Soviets into despair. Moscow trembled, Leningrad bled, and Stalin knew that, without help, it could all end in weeks. But how to feed an entire nation surrounded by Nazi fury, how to send tanks, food, ammunition, and fuel without falling into the clutches of the Luftwaffe or the hungry mouths of German submarines. The response was cruel, dangerous, almost suicidal. The Barents Sea, a narrow corridor of black, icy water, where icebergs emerged like sleeping monsters and the weather changed in minutes. A region where night could last for weeks and where death lurked like a constant shadow. There were no safe shores, no shelter, only storms that tore ships apart, waves as enormous as buildings, and a cold so biting it made metal crack like broken bones. Even so, Churchill called that route the vital line of the North, because that was exactly what it was. The only remaining viable route to supply the USSR, a thin line drawn across the frozen ocean, separating survival from defeat. And at that moment, the USSR was on the brink of collapse. Each train leaving Iceland carried more than supplies. It carried the last hopes of an entire country. If it failed, millions would die. If it succeeded, perhaps the tide of the war could turn. This was the scene, a deadly sea, a crippling cold, submarines hidden like hunters in the darkness, and men, ordinary men, from various countries who would have to cross this icy hell to keep the flame of resistance alive. The story of Murmansk Lifeline, it begins here, at the point where the frozen world and the most brutal war in history meet, and where every kilometer traveled could cost dozens of lives. The Allied decision and the race against time. When news from the Eastern Front began to reach the offices in London and Washington, the reaction was not one of surprise. It was one of terror. Images of Soviet cities engulfed in flames, reports of entire armies destroyed, millions of refugees wandering aimlessly through the ice. Everything pointed to the same thing. The Soviet Union was about to fall, and if she fell, the war would change completely. Hitler would dominate the entire East, freeing his forces to turn against the West once and for all. Churchill knew this. Roosevelt knew this. And above all, they knew that to prevent this future, they would have to make a terrible decision. Sending trains to the Arctic, to place men and ships on the most dangerous death corridor on the planet, a route so deadly that even naval war veterans shuddered at the sound of its name. But there was no alternative. It was that, or allow Europe to fall entirely under the shadow of the swastika. The decision was made in silence, in closed rooms, but the effects would be felt on the frozen seas. Churchill, with his ever-lit cigar, spoke with brutal candor. The situation demands sacrifices, and the sacrifice will be heavy. The generals and admirals present knew exactly what he meant. Each convoy sent north meant dozens, perhaps hundreds of lives wiped off the map. Ships would be split in two by enemy torpedoes. Men would freeze to death before even touching the water, and no one would ever find their bodies in the dark, icy depths of the Barents Sea. But time was pressing like a noose around the neck. The Red Army needed trucks, planes, weapons, fuel, food. It needed them immediately. If the convoys didn't leave now, there would be no one left to receive them later. It was a race against time and against death. The ports of Iceland and Great Britain quickly transformed into anthills of activity. Crews were hastily recruited, often without knowing exactly where they were going. Ordinary merchant ships were improvised as warships, and alongside them, cruisers, destroyers, and anti-aircraft ships took up positions as guardians of a caravan destined for sacrifice. The officers tried to maintain a composed appearance, but doubt was visible in their eyes, a doubt as heavy as the ice they would face. Are we sending these men to their deaths? Despite the fear, there was something bigger, something that pushed everyone forward, the idea that perhaps the fate of the world depended on them. Thus, amidst the icy breath of the North Atlantic, the first group of ships lined up, engines humming softly, propellers cutting through the black water, while the polar night enveloped. Everything like a veil of mourning. A race against time it had begun, and the deadliest route of the Second World War was about to be opened. The first roar of the engines in the Arctic cold. The day the first PQ convoys gathered to depart for the Arctic was no ordinary day. There were no speeches, no military music, no waving flags. The scene was somber. The sky was heavy. The wind was biting. It was as if even nature itself was warning. Go back. You don't belong here. But there was no turning. Back, ship by ship, the vessels began to line up in Icelandic ports, rocking beneath the icy waves. They were simple cargo ships, some rusty, others hastily patched together, carrying the weight of Sherman tanks, ammunition, disassembled aircraft, barrels of fuel, and tons of food, all packed together as if each piece were pure gold, because at that moment it was. The sailors, wrapped in thick coats, looked like shadows in the fog. Many were trembling, not just from the cold. They knew the reputation of that route. Stories whispered in taverns and naval bases, ships swallowed in seconds, men freezing alive, submarines that attacked and disappeared into silence. And that silence, the silence, was worse than any bomb. Then came the sound. A deep, low, almost monstrous snore, or the roar of two diesel engines waking up one by one, like drums announcing the beginning of a dark ritual. The entire harbour seemed to vibrate. The darkened water churned. The wind carried black smoke into the sky, like a harbinger of something terrible to come. For many of those men, it was their first time in the Arctic, and as they left port, they felt the reality hit them. The cold wasn't just cold, it was a knife's edge. Ice formed instantaneous layers on the deck, making everything slippery and treacherous. With each breath, the air burned from within like frozen vapor. The ships advanced in a line, slow but determined, following their escorts, slender British destroyers, heavy cruisers, and a few Soviet ships waiting further north. With each kilometer, the sea changed. The waves grew larger. The wind howled like a hungry animal. The ice began to accumulate so quickly that crews had to break it up with sledgehammers and axes to prevent the weight from sinking the ships. And yet, there was something almost poetic about that advance, a line of steel and courage tearing through the darkness, bringing hope to an entire country. But above them, unseen, enemy eyes awaited, because, at that very moment far away, in hidden bases in occupied Norway, German submarines were beginning to emerge. Luftwaffe seaplanes were being prepared on frozen runways. Radio operators picked up weak signals coming from the north. The enemy knew the trains were coming, and that meant only one thing: all hell was about to break loose in the Barents Sea. As the trains slowly sped across the Barents Sea, the world above the water seemed utterly deserted. A vast, white, empty and silent expanse, broken only by the wind whistling like an ancient lament. But there in the dark, frozen depths of the ocean, something moved, something patient, silent, and deadly. U-boats. The German submarines were already waiting. For the sailors on the convoys, the sea seemed like a merciless enemy. For the men inside the submarines, it was a narrow, cold, metallic tomb where the air smelled of oil, sweat, and fear. They slept in short shifts, with the constant sound of the hull creaking under the water. Pressure, as if it were about to burst at any moment. The German commanders, true hunters, observed everything through periscopes. In the darkness of the polar night, the convoys appeared as long shadows, illuminated only by weak lamps and the pale light of the moon reflected on the ice. For the submarines it was a feast. And then came the most dreaded moment, the launching of the torpedoes. It was fast, silent, ruthless. Men on merchant ships rarely saw the attack coming. First, a deep crack, a muffled sound, as if something gigantic had split in two beneath the water. Then an explosion ripped through the sea and the air simultaneously. The struck ship tilted violently. Fire took shape instantly, illuminating the frigid night with shades of orange, red, and blue. And the worst part was the sound, a metallic, high-pitched scream, as if the ship's hull were crying out as it broke apart. Men were thrown onto the deck. Some fell into the sea, where the water was so cold it burned like acid. Anyone who touched that water didn't last more than a few minutes. Their blood froze, the air disappeared, and soon everything was silent again. The U-boats reloaded. They observed. They chose another prey. The tension among the Allied sailors was constant. With every creak in the hull, every shadow on the water, their hearts raced. Many slept with life jackets on. Others prayed. Some simply stared at the dark horizon, knowing that somewhere there, perhaps just a few meters away, an invisible enemy was watching, waiting for the next move. The Allied destroyers tried to counterattack. They dropped depth charges, tremendous explosions that made the entire sea tremble. Sometimes they hit. Most of the time, they didn't. The submarines were fast, cunning, and experienced. They glided through the depths like snakes. And so, as the trains tried to maintain formation, each kilometer traveled was a victory snatched from the clutches of death. The Arctic had revealed its first monster, but it wouldn't be the last. For days, the convoys advanced through the Barents Sea, battling the cold, the ice, and the invisible submarines. But they knew they still had to face another enemy, one that came from above, and when it arrived, no one doubted its presence. It was at first a distant noise, almost like a swarm of bees. Some sailors raised their heads, trying to figure out if it was the wind, until the sound grew, gained strength, and transformed into the unmistakable roar of German engines cutting through the polar sky. The Luftwaffe had located the trains. Suddenly the low clouds parted, revealing metallic silhouettes plunging from the sky. Heinkel He-111s, Junkers U-88s, medium bombers specially adapted to operate in that hostile environment. The German pilots, accustomed to the cold and trained to attack maritime targets, advanced with clinical precision. For the sailors down there, the world had turned into chaos. Sirens, shouts, officers' orders echoed in the wind. Anti-aircraft machine guns began firing, spitting fire against the grey sky as enemy bombs fell like giant fists. The bombers descended so low that it was possible to see the pilots' faces, cold, focused, almost indifferent. The first bomb struck a British freighter in the middle of the formation. The explosion ripped open the hull as if it were torn paper. A jet of fire shot up into the sky, illuminating everything around it. Men were thrown into the sea, others disappeared on impact. And thick smoke covered part of the fleet like a sheet of mourning. But the Luftwaffe didn't just come to bomb. They also brought torpedo bombers, fast, low-flying aircraft that flew so low the sailors could feel the air displacement. They released their torpedoes, which glided through the water like silver snakes in search of targets. Each torpedo struck with the force of an earthquake. Ships rocked violently, some broke in two, others burned until they became black skeletons adrift. And in the midst of this hell, the cold made everything more difficult. Hands trembled, weapons jammed, water froze in their eyes, blinding the gunners. There were moments when the wind tore tears from the sailors' faces, not from emotion, but from physical pain, as if invisible needles were piercing their skin. Still, the Allies fought with all their might. Machine guns fired relentlessly. Shrapnel cut through the air. Each downing of an enemy plane was celebrated with hoarse shouts, because it meant, at least for a few seconds, a safer patch of sky. But the Luftwaffe kept coming. Attack after attack, charge after charge. The trains, trapped in that unprotected sea, were like cornered animals being attacked by hungry eagles. And with each new wave of bombers, it became clear that the crossing to Murmansk would not only be difficult, it would be a massacre. The Arctic, once again, was exacting its price in blood. The PQ-17 train set off like so many others, silent, nervous, pushed by the icy Arctic wind and the constant fear of what awaited it in the depths and in the sky. They were 36 merchant ships, protected by British and American escorts, all carrying the kind of cargo that could decide the fate of the war: tanks, weapons, fuel, ammunition, trucks. It was a living line of steel and courage crossing a dead ocean. But the PQ-17 wasn't just destined for cold weather and submarines. It was destined for tragedy. As the train moved forward, a rumor began to spread through Allied radios. The German battleship Tirpitz had left port. The Tirpitz, the Arctic monster, a floating metal mountain armed with cannons capable of splitting ships in two with a single shot. No convoy stood a chance against it. None. Panic spread all the way to the British Admiralty, and then came the fatal order, a dry message as cold as the sea itself: disperse. The escorts were ordered to abandon the merchant ships and form a distant defensive line. The cargo ships, now alone, scattered across the Arctic like sheep abandoned before a pack of wolves. The sailors knew what that order meant. In that instant, many felt their hearts sink. Some cried, some cursed, some simply clung to the deck, staring at the dark water as if they already knew their fate. Without protection, each ship was a perfect target, and the Germans realized this immediately. Submarines emerged like predators, smelling blood. The Luftwaffe swooped in like vultures over carrion. The attack began with almost ritualistic violence, torpedoes emerging from the darkness, bombs falling like heavy rain, low-flying planes spewing fire and steel. One by one, the ships began to disappear. Explosions illuminated the polar night with macabre flashes. The sea became a gleaming graveyard where remnants of wood, oil, and frozen bodies floated among blocks of ice. Entire crews were swallowed by the cold before they could even reach a lifeboat. The scream of a man struck by the ice lasted no more than a minute. Then, only silence. Some ships tried to escape, diverting to more northerly routes, running aground on the icy shores, blending into the fog. But the U-boats continued to follow them like shadows. It didn't matter where they went. The Arctic found them. At the end of this brutal hunt, the result was an absolute disaster. Of the 36 merchant ships, 24 were sunk. Hundreds of men died. Millions of tons of supplies, which could have saved entire cities, ended up on the frozen seabed. And the cruelest part, the Tirpitz never actually attacked. The order that condemned PQ-17 to death was based on a fear that never materialized. The PQ-17 train became synonymous with horror, error, and abandonment. A deep scar in the memory of all the men who survived, and a cold grave for those who were not so lucky. The Arctic devoured PQ-17, and he had not finished his feast. The climate as an enemy: storms, ice, and madness. In the Arctic, the climate was not merely an obstacle. It was an active, cruel, tireless combatant that killed more men than all the U-boats and Stukas combined on certain trains. After the massacre of PQ-17 in July 1942, when 24 of the 35 merchant ships were sunk, the sailors who still dared to navigate the northern route knew that the true master of that sea was not Hitler, nor Stalin, nor Churchill. It was the Arctic Ocean itself, a hostile planet that seemed to have decided that no human being belonged there. The storms arrived without warning, without logic, without mercy. 1. Day the sea might be almost calm, a grey mirror under a low sky, and suddenly the wind would rise to 120, 140 km/h. The waves grew in minutes, first 5 meters, then 10, then 15, 18 meters of black liquid mountains with white crests that broke with the roar of heavy artillery. The American Liberty merchant ships, hastily built in the shipyards of Baltimore and Seattle, creaked as if they were about to break in two. Welded steel plates, not riveted to save time, cracked with the extreme cold and the brutal twisting of the waves. The sailors heard the hull groan, crack, scream, a sound that remained in their souls forever. When the storm hit head-on, the ship rose up the wave almost vertically. The propeller leapt out of the water, spinning in the void. The engines roared in despair, and then the ship plunged down the other side into an icy abyss. The crew was hurled against bulkheads, pipes, ladders. Bones broke, skulls cracked. Men on deck simply vanished, sucked under by the sea or crushed against the railing. But the real silent killer was spray ice, superstructure icing. The Arctic wind picked up the seawater that the waves threw onto the deck and instantly froze everything it touched. In a few hours, a ship could gain hundreds, sometimes thousands of tons of ice. Liberty ships, with their already high center of gravity, became as unstable as drunks. They listed more. And if the captain couldn't balance the cargo or ballast, the ship would capsize and sink in minutes, with no chance of saving anyone. To combat the ice, the crews formed ice-breaking gangs that worked 24 hours a day. Sailors with sledgehammers, axes, iron bars, and coal picks climbed the masts, gun turrets, chimneys, and even the decks themselves, covered in a translucent crust that grew before their eyes. Each blow raised clouds of glass-sharp shards that the wind threw into their faces, cutting to the bone. Many wore makeshift goggles with slits, but the ice still got in. Their hands froze inside their gloves, first tingling, then burning, then dying. Their fingers turned black with frostbite. Some sailors, after hours of pounding the ice, saw their fingernails come off completely when they took off their gloves at night. There were cases of men losing pieces of their noses, ears, cheeks, devoured by the cold while they worked. A sailor from Convoy PQ-18 recounted that after 18 hours of breaking ice, his bunkmate simply couldn't close his hand anymore. His fingers were as stiff as wood. The next morning they were black. 3 days later they fell off. The drinking water froze in the tanks. The pipes burst. The sailors melted snow on the galley stove, but the snow on deck was full of soot and oil, so they drank black water that tasted like diesel. The food, canned meat, hard biscuits, frozen potatoes, had to be broken open with a hammer before cooking. Many preferred to eat frozen food anyway, because the simple act of chewing something hard helped remind them that they were still alive. And then came the polar darkness. From November to February, the sun did not rise. They lived in an eternal bluish-grey twilight, with only a few hours of twilight at midday. Men lost all sense of time. They slept when they collapsed from exhaustion, waking up without knowing if it was day or night. The lack of sunlight destroyed the mind. Deep depression, hallucinations. Sailors swore they saw their own sunken ships from PQ-17, sailing alongside, with ghostly crews waving. Others heard voices calling their names in the wind. There were documented cases of suicide, men who simply climbed onto the deck at night and threw themselves into the sea, preferring a quick end to slow suffering. A British officer from Convoy JW51B wrote in his diary, later published, that after 3 weeks without seeing the sun, he began to doubt his own existence. "Sometimes I think I'm already dead, and this is the Nordic hell that the Vikings feared." And even so, even with mutilated bodies, shattered minds, ships on the verge of collapse, the convoys continued. Because on the other side, in Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, millions of Soviets depended on those Sherman tanks, Hurricane planes, Studebaker trucks, boots, canned food, aviation fuel. Each ship that arrived was a battle won against planet Earth itself. The sky descends like a blade, the surprise attacks of the Luftwaffe. In the Arctic, the Luftwaffe didn't need absolute numerical superiority. It only needed patience, perfect camouflage, and the diabolical timing that the Germans had perfected in occupied Norway. The planes came from the Banak, Bardufoss, and Kirkenes air bases, icy fields, where German mechanics worked with bandaged hands to avoid freezing on the engines. The Ju-87 Stukas and Ju-88s were painted completely white in winter, with only the black cross slightly shaded to avoid being too bright. They flew low, close to the sea, using the waves as cover, taking advantage of the dim Arctic light that made it almost impossible to distinguish sky from water. The attack almost always began just as the pale sun tried to break through the horizon, that band of dirty light that lasted less than 2 hours. The Allied lookouts, their eyes inflamed by wind and snow, saw only white in every direction, until they first heard a low hum, almost inaudible beneath the roar of their own ship's engines. Then the sound grew louder. It became that characteristic wail of the Stuka's Jericho sirens, a descending lament designed by the German engineers themselves to destroy morale even before the bomb fell. Older sailors said it was worse than the bomb itself. The sound pierced their chests, squeezed their hearts, and made grown men wet their pants in terror. The Stukas dove almost vertically at an 80-90-degree angle, dropping their 500 or 1,000 kilogallons bombs from less than 500 meters above the ground to ensure deadly accuracy. The bomb would leave with a sharp whistle that ended in a roar capable of splitting a cargo ship in two. If it hit the engine room, the ship would explode in a ball of orange fire that contrasted violently with the endless white, and then sink in less than 4 minutes. The Ju-88s approached at level ground, faster, launching torpedoes from less than 300 meters from the target. The torpedo entered the water with a discreet plop, leaving a trail of bubbles, and 30 to 40 seconds later struck the side with a muffled explosion that made the entire ship tremble as if it had been kicked by a titan. Black water gushed in, mixed with heavy oil that burned on the surface, creating a toxic cloud that suffocated the men in the water. The Allied defenses were desperate. Merchant ships generally had 1 or 2 40mm Bofors guns and a few 20mm Oerlikon guns. Excellent weapons, but ridiculously insufficient in number. The escorting destroyers fired everything: 4-inch guns, pom-poms, Vickers machine guns. The sky filled, with red and green traces intersecting with the white dives of the Stukas. But often, the Germans came in coordinated waves. First Heinkel He-111s dropping high-level bombs to force the convoy to maneuver, then Stukas diving, then Ju-88s with torpedoes on the flanks. In Convoy PQ-18, in September 1942, the first after the PQ-17 disaster to have an escorting aircraft carrier, HMS Avenger, the Germans attacked with more than 90 aircraft in a single wave. They lost 41 aircraft, many to hurricanes, launched by catapult from the aircraft carrier, but still sank 13 ships. German pilots returned to base laughing, saying that the Allies fired like crazy but didn't hit anything because of the cold that froze the weapons' mechanisms. Allied sailors developed a visceral hatred for the Stukas. They called the sirens the cry of death. One American gunner wrote that, after hearing that sound 3 times in one day, he began praying that the next bomb would hit his ship and put an end to it. And worst of all was the helplessness. In the English Channel, there were coastlines to hide behind. In the Mediterranean, there were islands. In the Arctic, there was nothing. Just open sea, ice, low sky. A perfect stage where German hunters could calmly choose their target. Even so, even bleeding, burning, sinking, the trains continued, because each freighter that passed was a blow to the heart of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. Each tank delivered was one more T-34 in Stalingrad. Each box of spam was a Soviet soldier who would not go hungry. The northern route was the shortest path to hell, and the most necessary one for victory. And the men who sailed it paid the highest price a human being can pay without dying. They remained alive to suffer for another day. The invisible hunt. German U-boats enter the action. In the Arctic, the true predator has no wings and does not howl from the sky. It lives in the dark depths, where daylight barely penetrates 10 meters, and the pressure crushes any weakness. The Kriegsmarine's U-boats, especially the Type 7C, the workhorses of Donitz's fleet, turned the Barents Sea into a floating graveyard. They didn't need speed or heavy armor. They only needed patience, absolute silence, and the cold as their perfect ally. German captains called that tactic wolf pack. A U-boat would spot the convoy first, usually thanks to the large Focke-Wulf 200 Condor seaplanes that flew high and far from bases in Norway. The plane would transmit the exact position, speed, and heading. Then the radio silence was broken only once. Convoy sighted. Quadrant such and such. Come forward, all of you. And suddenly, 6, 8, 10 submarines would converge like sharks sensing blood in the water. They approached submerged during the day, using only the periscope for brief seconds to avoid detection. At night they emerged, navigating the surface to recharge their batteries and gain speed. Because in the Arctic, night was eternal in winter. And even in summer, twilight lasted for hours. The black hull of the U-boat blended perfectly with the dark sea and the floating ice floes. The attack always began in the same cruel way, without warning, without honor, without a chance to respond. The electric G-70 torpedo left no bubble trail. It was the perfect killer. It exited the bow tube with a dull thud that the submarine crew felt in their guts. It raced at 30 knots for up to 6 kilometers, guided only by gyroscope. When it hit, the impact was devastating. The 280 kilolus hexanite warhead ripped a 10-meter hole in the hull, below the waterline. Icy water rushed in at tons per second. If you hit the engine room, the ship would die in minutes. If it hit the ammunition hold, it would disappear in a fireball that illuminated the horizon for seconds before fading forever. Allied sailors saw only the sudden gush of water, the column of death. When the torpedo exploded, then came the screams, the hoarse alarm, men running to the abandoned ships with their hands already freezing on the railings. Lifeboats were launched, but many capsized in the waves or were crushed against the sinking hull. Those who managed to get into the boats didn't last long. The water temperature was 1.8 degrees. The thermal shock stopped the heart in less than a minute. Those who survived the shock went mad within 15 minutes, screaming as their bodies froze from the inside out. Inside the U-boat, the atmosphere was another kind of hell. The air became unbreathable after 24 hours submerged, filled with sweat, diesel oil, chlorine from the batteries, and vomit. The men grew filthy beards, their eyes red from lack of sleep. The cold penetrated the steel. The interior walls dripped condensation that froze into stalactites. The clothes never dried. Fungus grew on the bunks. But they continued because Dönitz promised the Knight's Cross to whoever sank more than 100,000 tons. One case that remains in everyone's memory is that of the U-255, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Reinhard Recher. In July 1942, during the PQ-17 massacre, he sank 3 ships in a single patrol, including the American John Witherspoon. Recher wrote in his war diary, "The English sail like sheep. We shoot and they die without knowing where the death came from." Another, the U-456 of Max Martin Teichert, became legendary for torpedoing the cruiser Edinburgh in May 1942, even under fierce attack from destroyers. The Allied destroyers tried to hunt them back. The British ASDIC sonar emitted that obsessive ping, ping, ping that drove the Germans inside the submarine crazy. It was like a hammer hitting their skulls. When they detected contact, they launched depth charges in diamond or cross patterns. The underwater explosions made the U-boat jump as if it had been kicked by God. Light bulbs exploded, pipes ruptured, men were thrown against valves. If the hull pressure gave way, the submarine imploded 100 meters away, crushing 50 men in a fraction of a second. But even when they were right, they rarely saw the result. The sea simply swallowed everything. Oil and debris rose to the surface, the only proof that the predator had died. And the U-boats kept returning, always returning, because in the Arctic, the cold did the dirty work after the torpedo. Nobody survived more than 20 minutes in the water. Bodies froze in grotesque positions, arms raised as if still pleading for help. The Germans called this White Death. Clean, silent, perfect. It was the most unequal hunt of the war. One side fought with radar, cannons and planes. The other fought with silence, darkness, and an ocean that had already chosen which side it was on. The train's disintegration. Chaos takes over in the Barents Sea, July 4th, 1942. American Independence Day. Cruel irony. At 9:23 p.m., the message arrives in code to the PQ-17 ships. Cruisers withdraw immediately to the west. Convoy disperse. Merchant ships proceed individually to Soviet ports. The silence that follows on the radios is heavier than any explosion. Nobody believed it at first. To scatter, to abandon the training that had protected everyone through months of bitter experience. It was like sending a herd of sheep running in all directions when faced with wolves and bears at the same time. The order came from the First Sea Lord, Sir Dudley Pound, in London. He was convinced, through mistaken intelligence, fear of the Tirpitz, and sheer panic, that German battleships were leaving Altenfjord to massacre the convoy. So, he sacrificed 35 merchant ships and 3,350 men to try and save 4 cruisers. It was the biggest single mistake of British naval warfare. As soon as the formation breaks, the convoy ceases to exist. What remains are 34 solitary targets. One had already been sunk before, scattered across hundreds of square kilometers of ice and darkness. The destroyers and corvettes of the nearby escort attempt to track some, but it is impossible. Each merchant captain is now alone with his ship, his crew, and his fear. And the Germans realize it immediately. Condors fly low overhead, marking positions like crows over corpses. U-boats receive the best possible news. Free the fighter. The Luftwaffe in Banach and Bardufoss receives orders to shoot down anything that flies. What follows is 4 days of absolute carnage. The American ship Daniel Morgan is torpedoed at night. It breaks in 2. The bow sinks in minutes. The stern floats like an accusing finger for hours before disappearing. Of the 54 crew members, only 16 are rescued days later, frozen, insane, their skin black with frostbite. The British ship Earlston is bombed by Ju-88s. The crew abandons the burning ship, but the lifeboats are strafed in the water, a common practice of the Luftwaffe in the Arctic. Only 8 survive. The Soviet U-334 tries to hide in the fog, but is spotted by the smoke. 3 torpedoes explode with such violence that debris is found 20 kilometers away. One by one, the ships are falling. Ships that had withstood weeks of storms, ice, and constant air attacks now die alone, with no one to witness it. The American Washington manages to reach Arkhangelsk alone, sailing 200 miles in a zigzag pattern, with the captain keeping the crew awake with benzodrine and burnt coffee. The British Empire Tide also miraculously survives, but these are exceptions. Of the 35 ships that left Iceland, only 11 arrived. 24 sunk, 153 sailors dead, 210,000 tons of war material lost, 3,750 vehicles, 430 Sherman tanks, 210 aircraft, 99,316 tons of general cargo, enough to equip an entire army, all at the bottom of the Barents Sea. The survivors arriving at Soviet ports are unrecognizable. Sunken eyes, icy beards, mutilated hands. Some no longer speak. Others weep incessantly. An American first mate later wrote, "We were not defeated by the Germans. We were defeated by our own leadership. They only came to finish the job." The PQ-17 became the ultimate symbol of the brutality of the Arctic route. After it, convoys, were suspended for 3 months. Stalin was furious. Churchill called it the most desolate episode of naval warfare. But the worst part wasn't the material loss. It was the breakdown of trust. Sailors who were already facing the icy hell now also had to confront the certainty that in the critical moment their own commanders could abandon them to death. The vital line of the North bled like never before. And yet, even so, in September, a new train departed, because there was no other choice. The Arctic did not forgive weakness, nor mistakes, nor fear, and the war continued. Castaways of the ice, the sea, becomes a living cemetery. When a torpedo or bomb hit, the ship didn't simply sink. It died in agony, taking dozens of men with it to the cruelest kind of death war ever invented, freezing alive. The water in the Barents Sea in the summer of 1942 was between 30 and 4 degrees C, a temperature that kills faster than any bullet. The thermal shock was immediate. The instant the body touched the water, peripheral blood vessels violently constricted to protect the torso. The heart raced, breathing turned into involuntary gasps, and the person swallowed ice-cold water. Within 15 to 20 seconds, the muscles in the arms and legs locked up. Swimming became impossible. Within 60 seconds, the person lost consciousness. In 3 to 5 minutes, the heart stopped. There was no fight for survival. There was only the blind panic of someone who realizes they are being frozen from the inside out. Those who managed to cling to a boat, raft, or wreckage lasted a little longer, sometimes half an hour, rarely an hour. But the 50-kilometer-h Arctic wind stole the remaining warmth. Skin turned waxy white, then bluish, then black. Eyes glazed over, mouths froze open in the last scream that never came out. Many died with their arms raised above their heads, the classic Arctic drowning posture, because their pectoral muscles froze first, pulling their arms up as if still pleading for help. The Germans knew this perfectly well. That's why, after sinking a ship, U-boats would sometimes surface and observe through binoculars. Not to rescue, they never rescued a single Allied soldier, but to confirm the death. A U-boat commander wrote in his diary, "They scream a lot in the first few minutes, then they become quiet, then they float. It's almost beautiful." The Luftwaffe was even more sadistic. In several recorded cases, Ju-88s and He-111s returned to the shipwreck site and strafed the lifeboats. Stuka pilot from PQ-17 reported making 3 low passes over survivors of the American ship Pancraft, just to see if they were still moving. Others threw hand grenades at groups trying to board rafts. Allied destroyers, when passing through the wreckage, faced the most terrible dilemma of the war. To stop meant certain death. U-boats were always nearby, and a stopped ship was an immobile target. So the commanders gave the order to move forward, even seeing hundreds of men at sea. The HMS La Malouine, for example, passed the spot where the Christopher Newport had been sunk. There were more than 40 men in the water, shouting, waving their already stiff arms. The British commander looked through his binoculars, saw familiar faces. They were merchant sailors who had dined with him 2 days before, closed his eyes for a second and ordered, "Full throttle. We cannot stop." A sailor on deck vomited on his boots as he watched the shipwrecked men disappear in the wake of the ship. Another case was that of the Soviet ship Dekabrist. When it sank, 21 men managed to climb onto a raft. They stayed there for 14 hours, huddled together to try to keep warm. One by one, they died. The last survivor later recounted that the companion next to him simply stopped trembling, a sign that his body had given up, and died with his head on his shoulder. When rescue finally arrived, a rare miracle, only 7 remained alive. All had lost fingers, noses, and ears. There were also those trapped inside the sinking ship. The American Alcoa Ranger was torpedoed at night. Part of the crew was trapped in the aft hold when the ship broke in two. The icy water rose slowly. They pounded on the steel walls with wrenches, pipes, their bare fists until their bones were exposed. Those outside heard muffled screams for hours until silence came. When the stern finally sank, there was no more sound, and there were the bodies, hundreds of them, floating face down, arms outstretched, hair frozen like wire. Some ships that passed by days later still saw the dead from PQ-17, perfectly preserved by the cold, floating like ice dolls. A Soviet officer in Murmansk recounted that, weeks later, bodies were still arriving on the coast of Novaya Zemlya. Blue faces, eyes wide open in silent screams, uniforms stiff as armor. The Barents Sea was not just a cemetery. It was a frozen museum of horrors where the dead lay on display as a warning to those who still sailed it. And worst of all, many shipwrecked. People died believing they had been abandoned by their loved ones, because no one came, because no one could come. In the Arctic, human solidarity simply could not survive the temperature. After the dispersal order, PQ-17 ceased to be a train and became a collection of solitary targets scattered across 400,000 kilometers of ice and darkness. Each merchant captain became a god in his own tiny and terrified universe. The American ship, Winston-Salem, headed north, entered the heavy pack ice, and deliberately ran aground on a beach off Novaya Zemlya to avoid being sunk. The crew spent weeks in the tundra, eating moss and waiting for Soviet rescue. When they were found, they were reduced to skeletons with beards down to their chests, talking to themselves, convinced that the war had ended years before. Olopana did the same. It deliberately ran aground on the island of Matochkin Shah. The men burned furniture, clothes, even books from the ship's library to keep warm. One sailor went mad and walked on the ice until he disappeared. His body was never found. The British Empire tide hid inside a giant iceberg, with its engines stopped, lights off, the entire crew in absolute silence for 48 hours straight. Any sound, a cough, a falling plate, could mean death. They heard German Condors flying overhead, heard the engines of U-boats on the surface, felt the ship tremble as ice floes were pushed by the wind. One sailor wrote in his diary, "We are dead, and we don't know it yet." The American Samuel Chase tried the opposite strategy. Maximum speed to the south, zigzagging like crazy, smoking like a chimney. For 4 days the captain didn't sleep. He drank coffee with Benzedrine, stood on the bridge with frozen binoculars in his hands. At one point, he saw a periscope 500 meters away and ordered such a sharp turn that the ship almost capsized. The torpedo passed 10 meters from the stern. The entire crew fell to their knees on deck, crying with relief. 2 days later, they saw another periscope and another torpedo and another miracle. They arrived in Arkhangelsk with the hull full of ice marks but intact. The Dutch Paulus Potter was less fortunate. It tried to hide in the ice, was spotted, bombarded, and the crew abandoned ship in lifeboats. The lifeboats were then strafed. Of the 78 men, only 19 survived, rescued by a Soviet ship 11 days later, with frostbite so severe that multiple amputations were necessary on both arms and legs. The Carlton was torpedoed, but it didn't sink immediately. It remained floating stern first, with 45 men aboard, without radio, without power, adrift on the ice. For 9 days they stayed there, watching German planes fly overhead, watching U-boats circle like sharks. They ate frozen biscuits, drank water-melting snow from the still hot engine. One by one, they began to die of cold inside the ship itself. When rescue arrived, only 11 remained alive. The dead were sitting in the mess hall chairs, frozen in the position of those waiting for dinner. The psychological terror was worse than any physical attack. Without radio, without knowing if the other ship still existed, each crew lived in a world where they were the last human beings alive. Sailors began to see ghostly lights on the horizon, northern lights that looked like the beacons of friendly ships. They heard voices in the wind. An American captain wrote that, on his fourth night alone, he began to talk to a photograph of his wife as if she could answer. Another, a Briton, ordered the crew to pray aloud every hour, just to hear human voices and remember that they were still alive. The ice also attacked. Ships that were stationary or moving slowly were slowly crushed by the ice floes. The sound was the worst, a deep, constant creaking, as if the planet itself were chewing on the hull. The metal screamed. The men felt the deck rise and fall in slow waves as the ice pressed down. Some ships literally broke in two without a single torpedo. Just the Arctic, deciding that enough was enough, and there was always the waiting for the next condor in the sky, waiting for the next periscope, waiting for the next creak of the ice, to wait for the next torpedo, which could come from any direction at any time without warning. A first mate on the River Afton, who miraculously survived, later said, "We were no longer afraid of dying. We were afraid of staying alive in that hell." Because in the end, after the dispersal of PQ-17, the greatest enemy was no longer the Kriegsmarine. It was emptiness, absolute silence, the certainty that no one would come to help, and the horrible feeling that the sea, the ice, and the sky had made an alliance to exterminate them all, one by one, until their last frozen breath. The Northern Vital Line wasn't just bleeding, he was drowning in his own despair. The silent death. The Arctic reclaims its dead. When PQ-17 broke apart like a body torn in two, the men who fell into the sea discovered the most terrible truth of war. The Luftwaffe and the U-boats were merely messengers. The true executioner was the Arctic itself, ancient, patient, absolute. It needed neither torpedoes nor bombs. It only needed to wait. Because in the Barents Sea, in July 1942, the water was 3 degrees Celsius, the air 5 degrees Celsius with winds of 40 km/h, and the wind chill transformed each breath into a blade of ice in the lungs. Death there wasn't noisy. There were no final explosions, no heroic cries. It was a polite, almost gentle death, arriving in a whisper, "Sleep now, everything is all right." The first symptoms came on quickly. Cold shock stopped the heart of some in less than a minute, a silent heart attack as the body desperately tried to pump warm blood to the torso. Those who resisted longer went through the stages with cruel precision. First, the violent trembling, teeth chattering so hard they broke, then the confusion. "Where's my coat? I'm burning up." And the man would take off his clothes, gloves, boots, even with his skin already blue. It was the paradox of hypothermia. The freezing brain made the castaway feel fire instead of ice. Many were found naked or half-dressed, with their clothes piled beside them as if they had undressed to sleep. A group from the American ship Bellingham drifted on a raft for 8 days. When they were rescued by a British minesweeper, only 9 of the 38 were still breathing. The dead were sitting in a circle, holding hands, frozen in the exact position they had tried to warm each other. One of the survivors, a 19-year-old stoker from Boston, couldn't stop crying, not from the cold, but because the last companion to die had taken off his own coat and placed it over him, saying through chattering teeth, "Here, brother, I'm warm now," and then simply rested his head on his shoulder and stopped shivering. Stopping shivering is the final sign. It means the body has given up. In another boat, from the British ship Earlston, the men saw something they would never forget. A Norwegian sailor, strong as a bear, began to softly sing a song from his childhood as he rowed, his hands already black. He sang for hours. Then he stopped suddenly, looked at the grey sky and said calmly, "My mother is calling me. I see her there in the snow." He lay down in the bottom of the boat, crossed his arms over his chest as if to take a nap, and died with a frozen smile on his face. The others couldn't after that. They remained silent because they understood. The Arctic was not just cold, it was a place where death seemed like a relief. The lifeboats were traps disguised as rescue boats. They froze inside and out. The soaked canvas turned to stone in minutes. The oars stuck to the ice. The sails, if anyone could hoist them, tore like paper. Inside the boat, the sea water that seeped in with the waves froze in layers, raising the bottom until the men's feet were trapped in solid blocks. To warm themselves, they urinated on each other's hands, the only warmth available. They drank their own urine when thirst came. When there was no more urine, they licked the ice from the edges, cutting their tongues into strips. In the lifeboat of the Dutch ship Paulus Potter, 19 men survived 11 days like that. When they were found, they had eaten their belts, the soles of their shoes, even the buttons off their coats. One of them lost both legs to gangrene. Another lost his mind. He kept repeating that, "The sea is warm, we just need to swim a little more." He never spoke coherently again. There were those who stayed on the ice floes, small, unstable planks that tipped over with the slightest movement. A group from the Soviet ship Friedrich Engels climbed onto one that seemed solid. They huddled together in a circle, back to conserve heat. The wind cut like a knife. One by one they fell asleep. When the last man awoke alone, his companions were stiff as statues, still standing, embracing each other. He tried to release them, but their arms broke. Like dry branches, he stayed there for 2 more days, talking to the dead until a Soviet seaplane spotted him. When they rescued him, he held the cap of a dead comrade against his chest and whispered, "He was cold. I just wanted to warm him up." And there were those that the sea simply refused to swallow. Bodies floated for weeks, perfectly preserved by the salty cold. Sailors from later convoys, PQ-18, JW51, reported seeing the dead from PQ-17 still afloat, face down, arms outstretched, hair stiff as wire, eyes open, staring at the seabed. They looked like wax figures. Some ships passed through entire fields of them, hundreds of bodies bobbing on the waves as if swimming in slow motion. A British first mate wrote in his diary, "It's like sailing in a liquid graveyard. The dead don't sink. They stay there, watching us go by as if asking why we're still alive and they're not." The Luftwaffe would sometimes return just to watch. Reconnaissance pilots would fly low, take photos and laugh over the radio. "Look at the English enjoying a summer bath." A Stuka made such a low pass that the propeller sprayed icy water onto a group of shipwrecked sailors. They raised their already stiff arms, pleading. The pilot flapped the wings in salute and flew away. Because in the Arctic even pity freezes. Of the nearly 200 sailors who fell into the water after the sinking of the PQ-17, fewer than 30 were rescued alive. Most simply disappeared, became part of the sea, became ice, became nothing. When the few survivors arrived in Murmansk or Arkhangelsk, they didn't talk much. They stared blankly into space. Some never again felt real warmth. Even in summer, even years later, they shivered as if they were still there. One of them, a 22-year-old American gunner, told the Soviet doctor who treated him, "I saw the devil, doctor, but he wasn't red with horns. He was white and silent, and he had the face of the sea." On that July night in 1942, the Arctic didn't just collect bodies. It gathered whole souls, and he kept it to himself as one guards a very old secret. Here, in this land of eternal ice, men do not belong. They are merely temporary visitors, and the visiting time is over. In the midst of this white desert, where every breath of wind feels like a blade and every minute is a fight against death, emerge the only ships that still have the strength and the obligation to try to save someone. The British and American destroyers that escaped before the total dispersal. But rescuing in the Arctic is not a military operation. It is a miracle. The hunt for life begins. HMS Ledbury, he is one of them. He cuts through the dark waves as if in a rage, radar on, lookouts with frozen binoculars in their hands. The entire deck is just ice. Ice on the cannons, ice on the ropes, ice on the metal, and then someone shouts, "Men in the water, starboard!" The destroyer slows down but cannot stop completely. If you stop, you become a target. If you become a target, everyone dies. It's the cruel dilemma of the Arctic route. Saving lives could cost all the lives on board. Even so, they try. The sailors throw ropes, buoys, and makeshift ladders. The survivors swim, or try to. One of them is nearly unconscious, and the wind is pushing him away. A British sailor, in a desperate act, hangs overboard and manages to grab the shipwrecked man's coat. Two colleagues pull them both up. The shipwrecked man barely speaks. The lips are white, the eyes dull. He is dragged inside and covered with blankets, but even so he trembles so much that his bones crack. "He's alive!" shouts the doctor, but nobody knows for how long. The Arctic fights against every rescue. Right behind it, another boat is found. The ice swallowed him halfway. 3 men inside. 2 are staring blankly into space, completely motionless, dead for hours. The third one is still breathing. He shakes the hand of the sailor who rescues him and tries to speak, but he can't. My throat. He froze. He shakes her hand again. That's all he can do to say thank you. Other ships repeat this ritual. The destroyer Wilton, he rescues 8 men and loses 2 in the process because they slip back into the water. The Lord Middleton, a smaller ship, picks up 5 survivors, each with frostbite so severe that their fingers simply break off when removed from their clothing. It's brutal, it's cruel, it's heartbreaking. But those rescued, those few, are proof that humanity still exists there. Even in that frozen hell, war attempts to prevent the impossible. The Luftwaffe doesn't stand still. German planes appear over the rescue ships, swooping down in low-level attacks to prevent any attempt to save lives. HMS Offutt performs aggressive maneuvers, throwing torpedoes and depth charges while trying to pull shipwrecked people aboard. Each explosion causes icy water to rain down on the sailors like razor blades. The captain knows he should flee, but he doesn't run away. He looks out at the sea, filled with bodies and boats. If we give up on them, tomorrow it will be us, and the rescue continues. Those who return carry the pain of those who stayed behind. Some ships manage to save half a dozen, others only 1, some none. But they all bear the weight of what they have seen. Men frozen with expressions of terror, bodies floating like wax figures, small groups clinging to planks, pleading voicelessly. The survivors, wrapped in damp blankets, cry without tears, because even that freezes. And the sailors from the destroyers, these men hardened by war, they remain in absolute silence. Because that night they saw the Arctic win, but they also witnessed the courage of men who, even when surrounded by death, refused to abandon another human being. At the end of the day, not many were saved, but every life snatched from that ice was a victory against the impossible itself. The war in the Arctic did not end with parades, fanfare, or triumphal speeches. It ended as it had begun, in the biting silence of the polar wind, in the metallic creaking of ice-covered ships, and in the shadow of those who never returned. When the last convoy broke through the Barents Sea and arrived in Murmansk, no one celebrated with true joy. It was impossible. Victory there was different. It was a victory bought with frozen blood and courage torn from the limits of humanity. The British and American sailors descended from the decks exhausted, their faces marked by the cold and the memory of the screams the sea had swallowed. The Soviets who awaited them brought neither medals nor red carpets. They brought hard, silent embraces, the kind only those who have survived the impossible can give. They knew, without those convoys, Moscow might have fallen, Leningrad might have died forever, and the war might have taken a different turn. But every cargo delivered, every Sherman tank, every ton of ammunition and food had cost lives. Lives that now rested in graves no one would ever find, scattered across the war's most hostile sea. And that is why, when the Northern Vital Line finally fulfilled its role, there was no explosion of joy. There was only a profound, almost religious feeling of duty accomplished. The names of the lost ships remained recorded in the reports, but their stories, the true ones, the tales of terror, courage, and sacrifice, lived on only in the memories of those who had seen the Arctic open its teeth And so, amidst ice, death, and darkness, a silent victory was born. A victory without waving flags, but one that carried more weight than many celebrated battles. It was the end of a hellish journey, but the beginning of an eternal memory. The reminder that, beyond the Arctic Circle, ordinary men faced something greater than armies. They faced nature itself, and won. The story of the Murmansk Lifeline is not merely a footnote in World War II. It is a brutal reminder that sometimes the battles that decide the fate of the world are not fought with just rifles, tanks, or entire divisions. Some of the most decisive battles are fought against the planet itself, against seas that devour steel, storms that blind men, and polar nights that extinguish even hope. The Arctic Corridor, that narrow path of ice and death, sustained an entire army when everything indicated that the Soviet Union would be crushed. Every ship that stayed afloat was a victory. Every ship that sank was a warning of how close the world came to collapse. The war in the Barents Sea proved that courage knows no temperature and that human determination can withstand even the cold that freezes the soul. And the most impressive thing? Most of these men never gained recognition. They had no cameras following them, no reporters narrating their exploits. Their victories occurred in the dark, in near absolute silence, while the ice cracked beneath their feet and enemy submarines lurked invisibly in the depths. They fought a war that no one saw, but that everyone felt. When we look at history today and try to understand why the Axis was defeated in the East, it's impossible to ignore that fragile thread, that vital line that crossed the Arctic. If it had been cut, perhaps the world would be different. Perhaps darkness would have won. But he didn't win, because sailors frozen to the bone continued rowing, because entire trains continued on their way through storms that seemed designed to kill, because ordinary men refused to give in even when everything around them said it was time to quit. Today, the Arctic still holds the wreckage of these ships, metal capsules slumbering at the bottom of a frozen sea like nameless tombs. And each one tells a silent story of sacrifice, a story that doesn't end with waving flags, but with a simple fact. The victory in the north was achieved by the skin of their teeth. And that is why, when we remember the Murmansk Lifeline, we are not just talking about supply routes. We are talking about resilience, about humanity, about pure, raw courage torn from despair, a legacy that cannot be erased, an eternal echo beyond the Arctic Circle, a testament to the fact that history is sometimes written in ice, but always with blood.